There is a story that most of us know from the Old Testament where a guy named Moses is running around in the wilderness trying to get away from his problems. Distraction, psychology would call it. He was in the wilderness of denial, the wilderness of escape, the wilderness of trying not to think about things, but he's got a heaviness in his heart. And there's a part of him that knows he's not living up to who and what he is. He feels lost. And so this one day, he encounters a burning bush out there in the middle of the wilderness. He's herding sheep. He's taking a farm labor job herding sheep just to get away from everything, to hide out. But you can't hide out from spirit. Spirit is always there. Spirit is always showing up or trying to show up. And really the question for all of us is, do we show up for spirit? And I don't mean that in a reciprocity sort of way or a punitive kind of way, the way some religions have. I guess instead of showing up, I would say, are we opening up to spirit? Are we turning in that direction? So Moses is out there in the burning bush, and the burning bush catches his attention. And he encounters the burning bush, and the voice lets him know that it is spirit. And then it says, hey, Moses, take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. And this idea of holy ground or consecrated ground has been something that's been with religion. It's in all forms of religion, really, but it's been in religion for a long time. There's a lot of interpretations of that. I'd like to share with you mine, if you don't mind. And my interpretation is that the burning bush, the presence of spirit, is saying, don't just turn toward me, don't just open up to me, but feel me. I was thinking about this the other day. I was somewhere where a bunch of little kids were running around on grass, and they were barefoot. I was taking a walk somewhere here in Chico, and I was near one of the parks, and there was a family there, all safe, all mask wearing, all doing their thing. And these kids were running around on the grass, this lush kind of grass, with no shoes on. And I wondered to myself, I thought, man, how long has it been since I felt something under my feet besides the sole of my tennis shoes, and to truly feel the environment. And what, this story of Moses is one that a lot of times we turn to and we gravitate towards because we love the power of spirit, the burning bush, the voice, sounding like James Earl Jones out there, yes, I'm God. And I got to talk to you, Moses. But then there's this idea of take your shoes off. And very often early in our spiritual journeys, we want that power because very often when we come into seeking spirituality, teaching, religion, whatever it is, it's because, we're in trouble. We have a challenge. We're broken. We're not feeling good. We're ill. We're diseased. Things are falling apart. And so we love the fact that we can come into a situation that can offer up more power than what we feel like we have. But there's an intimacy to it too. There's a sweetness to it. And being able to feel the ground, being able to feel God, being able to feel spirit, being able to come into the presence of a loved one, to have that intimate relationship, to show up for that. There's a story that comes from the Buddha's time when the Buddha walked the earth. And apparently there was a gentleman who very much disliked the Buddha. He thought the Buddha was an abomination because he had spread his teaching and it had changed the face of religion in that part of the world. And this was a man who wanted to hold on to the old ways. And this gentleman's employment was he kept a stable of elephants that were used for work in India, these working elephants. And there was one elephant in there that was obstinate and angry and aggressive and was lethal, was dangerous because this huge animal, and he had a lot of attitude, and he had a lot of, obviously something wounded within him that he couldn't reconcile. And so Nobody liked handling him. No one liked getting close to him. And sometimes he raised havoc on the stable itself, and the other elephants were freaked out by this elephant. So this man who had disdain for the Buddha had heard that the Buddha was nearby living in a forest for a few days. And so he thought, well, this is perfect. I can turn this elephant loose on him, and hopefully this elephant will take the Buddha's life, and we won't have to put up with his teaching anymore. So he turned the elephant loose out into the forest of the area. And so sure enough, the Buddha was out there, and he was in a clearing. He was standing in a clearing one afternoon, and he heard the crashing coming through the forest of this elephant coming towards him. And the elephant came through the forest and into the clearing and was obviously enraged and aggressive and angry and started coming towards the Buddha. And the way the mythological story goes is that the Buddha looked at him and made connection with his eyes. And then the Buddha softened his gaze. And he made the connection with the eyes, and he lowered his own eyes and softened his gaze. The elephant approached him. And as he approached, the Buddha put his hand up, palm out, like this, and just held it there. Fingers spread apart, non-aggressive, just held his hand out, the palm. The elephant came up towards him and stopped short of his palm. So he was very close to his hand. The Buddha stood there for a while, raised his gaze back into the elephant's eyes, and he slowly leaned forward and put his hand on the elephant's forehead, where he began to gently rub and caress and stroke his forehead. And the elephant's demeanor began to soften. And the legend says that at some point he allowed his trunk to drop, and he began to, with his trunk, blow the dust off of the Buddha's feet. And the Buddha continued to touch and caress him. And the way the story goes is that the Buddha then shared with him a teaching on karma. And he shared that the Buddha shared that he would be distressed to think that the elephant would have to live out a karmic existence if he went forward with destruction and death by his own means. And his great desire was that the elephant could live a peaceful life, a life of joy and a life of openness and a life of non-attachment to whatever it was that he felt within him that was so, that was the basis of the fires that were lit in him in terms of his aggression and his anger. After his short lesson, they stood there, his hand still on his forehead, gazing into each other's eyes from a softened place. The elephant then bowed one of his front legs gently, and then rose up, turned around, and went back to the stable and lived his life in a peaceful way. So what we have there is we have two beings coming together. And one of them is obviously in a place of distress, and the other being shows up to him in terms of the power that we read about in the Old Testament, that, you can't get away from, what should we call it? Presence, love, forgiveness, creation, possibility, potentiality. That's what the Buddha represented. And the Buddha came forward within this presence to have a relationship at that moment, to close that gap. He invited the being in. He didn't run the other way. He didn't yell and scream. He didn't pick up a stick. He didn't throw rocks at him. He simply said, come to me. Come within my space. Let's share the same space. Let me honor you. Looks like you could use a hug. Looks like you could use some caressing in your face. You're carrying the weight of the world in you. You're carrying the angst of what's going on. Let me be present for that. This whole month that we are celebrating here at the Center for Spiritual Living is basically coming down to the idea of like an intimate relationship with spirit. You know, we think of spirit again like the Old Testament, power, healing, showing up, James Earl Jones' voice. But now that there's a second piece to that within our spiritual growth and our journey to come into intimacy with that. There was a high school senior who had been living her whole life in the same town, out here in the West, California somewhere. A city that did not have, wasn't a place like Paris or Rome or London or New York or San Francisco. It was a city that didn't have much of a personality. And she'd grown up her whole life there. And she'd done really well in school. She entered her senior year and she had great grades and she was highly motivated and she was involved in all kinds of extracurricular activity and she was working with her guidance counselor. And so at one point she was applying for some scholarships and she had to bring forward a creative essay as part of that scholarship process. And so she had turned it into her guidance counselor, and it was up to her guidance counselor to begin to apply this essay to how it was needed to help her get some of these scholarships. So they sat down one day in the counselor's office, they were talking, and the counselor says, you seem to be in love with your hometown. See, she had written, her decision was to write an essay about her hometown. The young woman goes, no, I don't think so. Can't wait to get out of here. So the counselor says, you write in such detail with affection. Again, affection. The Buddha. Let's practice some form of affection. Well, the girl said, I just pay attention, I guess. Isn't that the same as affection? The counselor said. And the young woman goes, what are you talking about? The same as affection. Paying attention and affection. Presence, showing up, affection. You ever thought about affection as a spiritual practice? And we think of affection, I think, as physical affection, maybe between lovers. The Sufis like to interject that into this idea of God, but affection. I hear you. I can see your angst. Let me hand you a tissue. Let me be present with you. Let me take you in. But see, in the story of the Buddha, it wasn't just that the affection was there in his heart. His affection was in the lesson that he shared, the lesson on karma. It would trouble me to think of you going forward in terms of the cause and effect of how you're showing up in this way. It's interesting because the high school senior, after a couple of semesters at an East Coast college that was filled with ivy-covered walls and had been there forever, and it was gorgeous and beautiful, and there was art and there was culture and all of that. She calls her mom a couple of semesters later and says, Mom, I got to tell you, I miss so much the details of home. I miss the library. I miss where the fire station is. I miss that local parade we have. I miss the street that my high school is on. I miss our rusty mailbox. I miss the river that runs through and how it cooled us off in summer evenings. I miss those things. I have an affection for those things. Ernest Holmes says about this, the mystic conception of the Christ consciousness is a revelation of our universal birthright held forth to all creation. When he uses the word birthright, that's an affection phase because it means we are children, our birthright, the divine parent, that loving presence, birthright, the birthright of love. We comprehend the infinite only to the degree that we show up and allow ourselves to recognize its expression. The elephant recognizing the expression of the Buddha. The young student recognizing how this town has loved her and taken care of her. We comprehend the infinite only to the degree that we show up and allow ourselves to recognize its expression, becoming to us that which we believe it to be. That which we believe it to be. Do we believe that God is love? Do we believe that we have a relationship? Do we believe that it's intimate? We cannot come unto God in heaven except through showing up through our own spiritual nature. Carrying out the wishes of the infinite parent to all. Now, the Buddha wasn't one to talk about God much, but so let me be so presumptuous as to interject a little divinity there that, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Elephant, you have a birthright. That birthright is peace and joy and love. And I want to honor that in you. I want to try and share something with you. Some wisdom that can keep you in a place where life is a good thing to live. When I was a teenager, I was raised in Christian churches and evangelical churches, and I was probably about 13. I was a young teenager, and there was this big youth group outing, and so the big thing was to go to some lake with a bunch of ski boats and spend the day, and in good, wholesome, clean Christian fun. And the family, there were some adults there who donated their boats for the day and drove the boats, and we all went water skiing, we went swimming, we had a barbecue, and then the youth pastor gave us a little talk afterwards, and that was kind of what it was. And we sang together, and there was some, this is back in the early 70s, so some hip long-haired Christian with a guitar would play, and we would sing these songs and stuff. And I had a couple friends, and I'm not putting this off on them because I was involved in this as much as anyone, but we decided we were going to bring a little bit of marijuana to the lake. And so we did, and we snuck off somewhere, and we smoked a little bit of marijuana, 3 or 4 of us or whatever. And so we got busted. They caught us. So this was a huge deal back in 1970. And the other parents, their kids were telling them about it, and the minister, had all kinds of complaints, and people were upset, and how can you let that happen? And you want to talk about elephants and karma. Later on I became a minister, so yeah, that was my karmic journey, right? So anyway, because I know what it's like to get phone calls and people upset, and how could you let that happen and stuff. And so anyway, that's a little aside. So where was the Buddha when I needed him, right? Okay, so anyway. The church was trying to they were trying to figure this out, and I get it. They had to show these other parents that they were serious about protecting things, and this is not what we condone in our church, and this is terrible, and we can't believe these kids. And so all of us, our parents, were deeply involved in the church. My mom was a Sunday school teacher. My dad was a deacon, which is a big deal, And so, and I mean, the minister would come over and eat dinner with my family and all kinds of stuff. I mean, they're very connected. And so here I am sitting in front of the deacon board with my 3 or 4 compadres, and these men, these World War II era men, these deeply religious men. My dad was one of them. To say, "Oh my God, we have drug using, kids in our midst," and so they were trying to figure out what to do with us. And so it got pretty rough. And I understand that today. I mean, they were coming from a place of fear, and they didn't want, they were worried about us, and they were worried about their church and things like that. And so it was being floated around that we would be cast out. Is the old Christian thing of, if there's a wolf within the flock of sheep, you cast them out. And I sat there and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, what am I going to do? What is this going to do to my parents? What's this going to do to us? I mean, I can't imagine anything more horrendous. And my dad's sitting in the room. So all these guys were talking. They were all struggling with it. These are, blue collar kinds of guys, hardworking guys, deeply devout Christians. None of them were really in the people business and stuff, not sophisticated in that way. And there was this gentleman, and I'll never forget him. He was an old cowboy, and he was the real deal. He was a real cowboy. That's how he made his living his whole life. His family did that ranching and stuff, and he was an old rancher. And he sat there, and he really didn't say anything until the very end. He said, I think every single one of us, we've been a young boy in our life. We've been a young kid, and we probably did some pretty stupid things. Especially back in the war when we all went off into the other parts of the world and we were afraid and we were trying to fit in. And he said, I think what these guys did was pretty stupid, but I think that a lot of it had to do with just how young they are. And I would hate for them to lose their church too, and for their families to lose them. Interesting thing was, this gentleman, he and his wife never had children. He didn't have children of his own. And he came forward. And I remember feeling a sense of affection in that, feeling a sense of presence, of intimacy, that he was willing to show up for us, the 3 or 4 of us sitting there. And like the Buddha, came close with the hand and said, I can see that your age and what you're going through is tough. And we want to be here for you. And I think that he allowed the whole rest of the room to grab a hold of something that seemed like it was grounded in spirituality and love and connection and affection. Show up for affection. Show up and just be present. Show up and remind each other that we're loved. Our teaching, if you remember what I read about homes, our teaching says there is a presence of God within us. So like the Karen Drucker song says, you are the hands, you are the heart, you are the voice of spirit on earth. That's what the Buddha was. That's what the high school counselor was. That's what a gentleman named Louis was back when I was a kid. The cowboy who spoke a quiet truth. To be able to open up and to be able to be present and intimate and show affection. If we want to see God as love, affection, presence, a healing energy, and we are the embodiment of God, then that means that we have to show up for the elephants. We have to show up for the Moseses who are lost. We have to show up for the teenagers who are trying to find their way. That is what showing up is about. Let me join you. Let me come to you. Let me be here with you. Let me share some wisdom with you too. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to me. Namaste for that. Okay.